All right, so let's jump into something that I think a lot of our listeners are probably curious about when it comes to planning for the future, and that is precious metals IRAs. We hear about them, we know they're a thing, but like, who are they actually for?
Yeah.
What are the benefits? And, how do you even go about getting started if it's something that you're interested in?
Right.
So, to really dig into this topic, we are going to be diving deep into an article from Doug Young.
Okay.
He is someone who has over 20 years of experience in financial investing, commodity trading, and specifically precious metals. So we're in good hands, I think.
Yeah.
And the article is titled Precious Metals IRA Eligibility, Who Qualifies?
Okay.
So we'll take that as our guide for this deep dive and see if we can't really get to the bottom of, whether this is something that folks should be considering as part of their long-term financial plans.
Awesome. Sounds
Yeah.
good.
It does. So right off the bat, one of the things that I think people are often curious about is who can actually do this? Is this something that's only for the super wealthy? Is it only for people of a certain age? Like, what are the eligibility requirements here?
Yeah. In the article does a good job of sort of outlining that, and it's actually very inclusive. So when it comes to age, there's really no minimum and no maximum age limit.
Oh, interesting.
It's really just about having earned income.
Hmm.
So whether you're 18 or 80, as long as you have that earned income, whether it's from employment or self-employment, you're eligible to open and contribute to a precious metals IRA.
So you're saying that basically you could be, fresh out of high school, got your first job, and you could start looking into this as an option.
Absolutely.
Or you could be, well into retirement and still be able to contribute.
Yeah. The article even uses the example whether you're just starting your career or nearing retirement.
Wow. Okay.
As long as you've got that earned income.
Okay. So that's pretty broad in terms of age. What about income level?
That's interesting, too, because there's actually no maximum income limit.
Oh, okay.
So there is a limit in terms of how much you can contribute annually, but there's no limit on your income level to be able to contribute.
So even if you're, making a significant amount of money, this is still an avenue that's open to you.
Exactly. And the article actually even highlights that this can be particularly beneficial for high-income earners who want to diversify their portfolios, which I think is a really important point.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So we've got that kind of broad overview of eligibility in terms of like age and income level.
Hmm.
Maybe just to give people a little bit of context, like in terms of how much we're talking about, could you maybe just touch on the contribution limits just so people have a sense of that?
Right. So for 2025, if you're under 50, the annual contribution limit is $7,000.
Okay.
And if you're 50 or older, it bumps up to $8,000.
All right. So we got age, we got income, we got contribution limits. So I think we've got a pretty good handle on who can actually participate. Now, the next question becomes, well, what can they actually put into these accounts? What are the eligible precious metals that we're talking about here?
Right. Yeah. And it's not just any old, gold bar or silver coin you can put in there.
Yeah.
The IRS has pretty specific guidelines
Of course. Yeah.
for the types of precious metals that are allowed in these retirement accounts, just to ensure the quality of the investment.
Right. Makes sense.
So starting with the most popular one, gold. The minimum purity requirement is 99.5%.
Okay. So pretty pure.
Yeah, it's pretty pure.
Are there any like specific examples that the article gives us of like what kind of gold products would qualify?
Yeah. So they mention things like American Gold Eagle coins,
Okay.
Canadian Gold Maple Leaf coins,
Mm-hmm.
Austrian Gold Philharmonic coins,
Okay.
and then also gold bars and rounds from refineries that are approved by, major exchanges like NYMEX or COMEX.
So those are the big like commodity exchanges.
Exactly. So it's got to be, investment grade bullion. We're not talking about, decorative pieces or jewelry or anything like that.
So real deal stuff.
Yeah. Real deal bullion.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
What about silver? Is it similar?
Yeah. Silver is similar.
Okay.
The purity requirement's actually even stricter. It's 99.9%.
Oh, wow. Even higher. Okay.
Yeah. And again, you've got some similar examples like the American Silver Eagle coins, Canadian Silver Maple Leaf coins, Austrian Silver Philharmonic coins, and then those silver bars and rounds from approved refiners.
Okay, so basically the same concept, just different purity levels.
Exactly.
Now, I know gold and silver are kind of the big ones that people think about when it comes to precious metals. Are there any others that are eligible for these IRAs?
Yeah, the article mentions a couple more in the FAQ section.
Oh, okay.
So platinum and palladium are also eligible, and those both have a minimum purity requirement of 99.95%.
Okay, so you got a little quartet of precious metals to work with there.
Exactly.
Okay, so we know who can invest. We know what they can invest in.
Now, the big question, why? What are the actual benefits here that might lead someone to say, okay, this is something I want to consider?
Yeah. So the article highlights a couple of key advantages. And one that really stands out is that precious metals can provide stability, especially during times of economic uncertainty, When traditional investments like stocks, take a downturn,
Yeah.
precious metals often tend to hold their value or even increase in value.
Kind of like a safe haven.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The article even points to the 2008 financial crisis as an example, where, gold actually saw significant price increases while a lot of other assets were, plummeting.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it can kind of act as like a counterbalance or almost like an insurance policy, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so stability is a big one.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
Well, another benefit that's often cited is that precious metals, particularly gold, can act as a hedge against inflation. Okay, yeah. Inflation's been a big topic of conversation lately, so that makes sense that would be a factor here. Can you explain a little bit more about how that works?
Sure. So, historically, precious metals, and especially gold, have been seen as a way to kind of protect your wealth against the declining purchasing power of, paper money due to inflation.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that as, the value of currency decreases over time, the intrinsic value of precious metals, it tends to rise. So it can help to, preserve the long-term value of your savings.
So you're not losing out as much to that inflation as you might with, say, just holding cash or something like that.
Exactly. The article puts it this way. Gold traditionally appreciates in value over time, whereas the value of paper money declines due to inflation.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, another thing that we hear all the time when it comes to investing is the importance of diversification.
Mm-hmm.
So how does adding precious metals into the mix play into that, that idea of diversifying your portfolio?
Yeah. So diversification is basically just, not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Right. Don't put everything in one stock or one whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
So by including precious metals in your retirement portfolio, you're not just relying on, the performance of stocks and bonds.
Right.
And that can help to, kind of smooth out the overall returns of your portfolio, reduce the impact of those market swings. The article highlights that this balanced approach can help ensure more stable growth over the long term.
Okay, so it's kind of like, you're spreading out the risk a little bit.
Exactly.
Having things that, might perform differently under different economic conditions.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the advantages, the benefits of potentially investing in a precious metals IRA. If someone's listening and they're thinking, okay, this is intriguing, I'm interested, I want to explore this further, what are the steps involved in actually opening one of these accounts?
Sure. So the process involves a couple of key players and steps.
Okay.
So the first thing you'll need to do is select a Gold IRA company.
Okay.
And this is essentially the company that will guide you through the process and help you with the logistics of setting up and managing the account.
Gotcha.
You'll also need to choose a custodian.
Okay.
And this is a financial institution that's responsible for actually holding the assets in your IRA. So they're kind of the safekeeper, if you will.
So it's not like the gold bars are going to be delivered to your house or anything.
No.
They're going to be held somewhere safe and secure.
Yeah, exactly. And the good news is that Gold IRA companies often have, established relationships with custodians, so they can typically recommend one to you.
So it's kind of like a one-stop shop almost.
Yeah, it streamlines the process.
Okay, so we choose a company, we choose a custodian. What happens next?
Right. So once you have those pieces in place, you'll need to fund your account. And there are a few different ways you can do that. You can make direct cash contributions, which is probably the most straightforward way. And of course, those would be subject to the annual contribution limits that we talked about earlier.
Right.
You can also do something called a rollover, where you transfer funds from an existing retirement account, like a 401k or a traditional IRA, into your precious metals IRA.
Okay, so you can kind of shift money around.
Exactly. And then you can also do what's called a direct transfer between IRAs. And this is basically, moving funds from one IRA to another without actually taking possession of the money.
Okay, so a little bit less paperwork, less hassle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a tax advantage way to do it as well.
Okay, so we've chosen our players, we've funded the account. what's the next step?
Well, then comes the fun part.
Okay.
You actually get to choose the precious metals that you want to include in your IRA.
Okay.
So you'll work closely with your Gold IRA company
Uh-huh.
to select and purchase the, IRS-approved metals.
Okay.
And they can provide guidance and make sure that you're choosing, eligible products that meet those purity standards that we talked about earlier.
Right. Make sure you're not getting ripped off or anything like that.
Exactly.
Okay, so that sounds pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing that, always comes up with retirement accounts is the tax implications.
Right.
So what are we looking at here in terms of the tax benefits associated with a precious metals IRA?
So from what we see in the article, precious metals IRAs offer similar tax advantages to traditional and Roth IRAs.
Okay.
Generally, you've got two main options.
Okay.
You can choose what's typically referred to as a traditional precious metals IRA.
Okay.
And in this case, your contributions may be tax deductible
Mm-hmm.
in the year that you make them. And your investments would grow tax deferred, meaning you wouldn't have to pay taxes on the gains until you actually take distributions in retirement.
Okay. So you kind of kick the can down the road a little bit.
Exactly.
Pay the taxes later. Okay. What's the other option?
The other option is, more of a Roth IRA structure. And the article mentions the concept of tax-free growth. So in that case, you'd be paying taxes on your contributions up front,
Okay.
but then qualified withdrawals in retirement, including any gains, would be tax-free.
Okay. So pay now, enjoy it later.
Exactly.
Okay. So two different options, kind of depending on your tax situation and your preferences.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely something to consider and, consult with a tax professional on to make sure you're making the right choice.
Right. For sure. Now, the article also has a little FAQ section at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And I always think those are helpful, just to kind of reiterate some of those key points.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So anything, stand out to you from the FAQ that we haven't already kind of touched on?
Yeah. It just reinforces a couple of things, just to make sure it's clear. It reiterates the specific types of precious metals that are eligible and those purity requirements. So just as a reminder, gold, 99.5% purity.
Yeah.
Silver at 99.9%. And then both platinum and palladium requiring a minimum of 99.95% purity.
So they're really making sure that it's the real deal.
Exactly. Investment grade.
Okay.
And then it also confirms that you can transfer funds from your existing IRAs into a precious metals IRA,
Okay.
either through a direct transfer or by rolling over funds from another retirement account like a 401k.
So if you've already got some retirement savings, you can kind of, shift things around, diversify a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. Gives you some flexibility.
Okay, so let's kind of bring it all together. What have we learned?
It seems like eligibility for a precious metals IRA is pretty broad. Basically, if you have earned income, you're probably eligible. You can hold, very specific forms of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium within the account. We talked about the benefits, that potential for stability during those rocky economic times.
Yep.
Hedging against inflation.
And then, that diversification factor, which is always a good thing to have in your portfolio. We talked about the steps involved. Choosing that company, choosing the custodian, funding the account, picking out your metals.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, the tax advantages that are similar to those traditional and Roth IRAs.
Yeah. You've covered all the bases.
All right, good. So, as you're listening to this and you're thinking about, your long-term financial strategy, here's a question I want you to kind of ponder.
Okay.
We're living in a world where there's a lot of, potential for economic volatility. We've got inflation to think about. How might incorporating some tangible assets like precious metals into your retirement plan provide that extra layer of, security and diversification that you might not get with just, the typical stocks and bonds? Is this an avenue that's worth exploring further?
Yeah. Definitely something to think about.
All right. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We hope you found it informative, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.